If you like what you're about to hear, please consider leaving a review, or liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing on YouTube. I don't have a Patreon or enable ads for this, so if you really like Oldex, please do contact Games Workshop on social media or via email, and tell them you want me to narrate their audiobooks for realsies. Oldex, Codex Chaos Space Marines, 4th edition, pages 58 and 59, The Wolf of Fenris, written by Gav Thorpe and Alessio Cavatore, narrated by R.J. Bailey, with great thanks to Alistair for donating this copy of Codex Chaos Space Marines. The Wolf of Fenris. One of the most infamous tales of the Red Corsairs concerns the capture of the Wolf of Fenris. Lured into an ambush, this Space Wolves strike cruiser fell during fierce fighting around Parenxis. More than any other resource, Huron Blackheart and his Red Corsairs need ships. Without their fleet, the renegades of the Maelstrom would be unable to launch their raids on the Imperium, nor be able to evade the punitive Imperial fleet sent after them. The Red Corsairs need not any kind of starships, but ships capable of interstellar travel through the warp, and the crews to man them. The ancient vessels of the Astral Claws forms the core of their fleet, but the majority of their other ships are small merchantmen that have been refitted as makeshift warships. When Huron's scout ships returned with reports that a Space Marine patrol was waiting to intercept him as he traveled to raid the world of Parenxis, the Blood Reaver determined to capture one of the vessels for his armada. The Battle of Parenxis. Forewarned of the Astartes task force, Huron left several of his ships in reserve. He then took a more circuitous route to Parenxis than was necessary, arriving in the system on the opposite side of the star. As the Deathhawks and Space Wolves vessels moved to intercept the Red Corsair fleet, Huron's reinforcements attacked from the opposite direction. The Space Marines were caught between the two renegade fleets and desperately tried to break out of the trap. The fighting was fierce and short-ranged, and several of the Space Marines managed to fight their way clear. Rather than pursue them, as he would normally have done, Huron chose to concentrate his efforts on the two remaining vessels. Huron dispatched one of his ships to watch the retreating Astartes, in case they should return. Meanwhile, he maneuvered his fleets into a wide net that forced the trapped Space Marines closer and closer to the Parenxis star. Knowing the Space Marines would turn and fight, and possibly self-destruct their vessels rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands, Huron deliberately left a gap in his closing fleet. Or so it seemed. In reality, Huron placed his flagship there on minimal power so that it could not be detected at long range. Sure enough, the Space Marines noted the seeming flaw and broke through the opening. One of them, a Flamehawk's cruiser, was so badly damaged during its breakout that Huron let it escape, knowing he could not have the resources to repair it. The other ship, the strike cruiser Wolf of Fenris, suffered a crippling hit to its engines as it broke free. There was still a good chance the Space Wolves would attempt to destroy their own vessel if they realized it might be captured, so Huron's battle barge remained hidden. Instead of a full-scale boarding attack, Huron dispatched his Red Corsairs in boarding torpedoes, some 120 warriors in total. The initial assault. Drifting almost silently through the void, the boarding torpedoes of the Red Corsairs split into 3 waves. 5 of them, with their complement of 50 renegades, used small bursts of their attitude thrusters to direct themselves towards the aft section of the Wolf of Fenris. Their task was to capture the engine rooms and plasma reactors, thereby rendering the Space Wolves incapable of destroying the ship by the quickest means. Only when the torpedoes were less than half a dozen kilometers away were they detected by the auguries of the Space Wolf's ship. For several seconds, defense turrets opened up a furious bombardment around the torpedo wave. Despite the intensity of the barrage, only one torpedo was destroyed, and the surviving 4 struck home. With explosive melter charges, the boarding torpedoes smashed their way through the armored hull of the strike cruiser. Frag launchers mounted in their tips exploded, filling the interior of the ship's chambers with a storm of shrapnel to clear defenders. Lightly armored chapter serfs, the majority of any Space Marine vessel's crew was scythed down in their dozens. As strobing photon flash fields detonated, blinding and disorientating any survivors, the fronts of the torpedoes opened up like the petals of a flower, and the red corsairs stormed out. Their auto-sensors unaffected by the visual barrage unleashed by the torpedo's entry, the renegades let loose a hail of fire with their bolters. Any serfs that survived the volley were quickly cut down by axe and sword, and within half a minute the red corsairs were in control of the antechambers around the plasma core. A counterattack, led by one of the Space Wolf's Iron Priests, was short-lived as the red corsairs deployed their las cannons and melter guns to the attack. Melter bombs were used to breach the main reactor chamber itself. Within 5 minutes of their first detection, Huron's warriors were in complete control of the aft section of the Wolf of Fenris. The main attack. Aided by the knowledge of Space Marine combat doctrine and the common layout of Space Marine strike cruisers, Huron had directed his second wave to attack a point roughly a third of the way from the ship's prow. Cutting into storage vaults, 30 red corsairs encountered initial resistance from 2 Space Wolf squads in the breached bay. The 2 sides clashed, head-on, exchanging short-ranged bolter fire and then engaging in ferocious hand-to-hand fighting. They tore into each other with bolt pistols, chain swords, knives, and, on the part of the Space Wolves, fangs. Though the fighting was bloody, it was brief, and the red corsairs succeeded in seizing the chamber and spreading a perimeter into the surrounding corridors and vaults. As Huron had calculated, by this point the Space Wolves' counterattack against the renegades in the engine rooms was gathering momentum. The red corsairs had improvised additional barricades and sighted their heavy weapons to rain heavy bolter fire and las cannon blasts down the access corridors. Advancing directly into the teeth of this resistance, the Space Wolf squads faltered and were eventually pinned down in several areas surrounding the ship's plasma reactor and the adjoining antechambers. It was now that Huron launched the third phase of his attack. At the head of the remaining red corsairs squads, the Blood Reaver struck directly for the bridge. Huron guided his flotilla of boarding torpedoes to smash a breach less than 50 meters from the control deck. Huron led a headlong charge towards the massive armored doors leading to the bridge, mercilessly cutting down a squad of Space Wolves that blocked his path. With the entry portal secured, the red corsairs brought up a phase field generator to breach the titanium-reinforced doors, tended to by the former head of the Astral Claws Tech Marines, Armanius Valthex. As the phase field generator was being prepared, Huron readied his men for the Space Wolves' response. The commanders within the bridge called for reinforcements to move forward from the engine bays. While several squads were left behind to ensure no counterattack was launched from the aft sections, the Space Wolves advanced to attack Huron's position outside the bridge. At this point, the 3 squads of the Red Corsairs' second wave launched their ambush, catching the Space Wolves between their assault and the rear guard of the Blood Reaver's squads in the prow. The Space Wolves suffered heavy casualties in the first few minutes and were forced to divert their strength away from Huron, breaking towards the starboard gun decks. Here, the Space Wolves were pinned in place by continuous fire from the Red Corsairs of the second attack, reinforced by 2 more squads dispatched by Lord Huron. The Wolf falls. With his rear quarter secured, Huron had his Tech Marines activate the phase field generator. Projecting a localized warp field, the generator vaporized a perfect circle of the armored gateway. With a cluster of frag grenades preceding their attack, the Red Corsairs stormed into the bridge, Huron leading from the front. The deck crew numbered only a few Space Wolves, and they fought to the death. The ship's commander, Njal Bluetooth, struck Huron repeatedly with his glowing power axe, but could not damage the tyrant's heavily armored augmetics. In reply, Huron ripped apart the Space Wolf's commander with the tyrant's claw, and pulled out his fangs to keep as a trophy. With the bridge and engines under his control, Huron brought the Wolf of Fenris to a full stop, and signaled to his battle barge to power up and move in for a full boarding assault. With overwhelming numbers now on his side, Huron was able to sweep the vessel from prow to stern, eliminating all resistance. In the port gunnery decks, the Space Wolves fought with vigor and determination, selling their lives dearly as a scarred, grizzled wolf priest roared and bellowed his hatred of the renegades. On the starboard side, it seemed at first that the Red Corsairs might be held out of the gun decks. Then, without warning, several of the Space Wolves turned on their brethren, attacking them from behind before surrendering to the mercy of the Blood Reaver. They recounted their oaths to the Space Wolves, Leman Russ, and the Emperor, and swore new pledges of loyalty to Huron. As a reward for their treachery, Blackheart granted them command of the Wolf of Fenris. In all, the boarding action had taken nearly 4 hours, and had cost the lives of many Red Corsairs. Their gene seed was collected, along with that of the dozens of slain Space Wolves, and passed on to Lord Garyon, once Chief Apothecary of the Astral Claws, and now known as the Corpse Master. Thus it was that Huron Blackheart claimed his greatest prize, the Wolf of Fenris. You have been listening to Oldex, Codex Chaos Space Marines, 4th edition, pages 58 to 59, The Wolf of Fenris, written by Gav Thorpe and Alessio Cavatore, narrated by R.J. Bailey. With great thanks to Alistair for donating this copy of Codex Chaos Space Marines. Thank you to Gav Thorpe and Alessio Cavatore for writing the fiction I grew up with. If you enjoyed this, please leave a review where you found it, or like, share, and subscribe on YouTube, depending how you're listening. I don't have a Patreon or enable ads for this, so if you really like Oldex, please do contact Games Workshop on social media or via email and tell them you want me to narrate their audiobooks for realsies. This production, like all of Oldex, is entirely unofficial and uncommercial, from an out-of-print publication, is a derivative work with all copyrights owned by Games Workshop, and is a celebration of the hobby and lore I grew up with. If you have suggestions for other old Codex fiction for me to narrate on this podcast, you can comment, contact me on Twitter at rjbailey, or email robertjbailey@gmail.com. Links are in the show description.